Hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I am Pastor Josh Pines, coming to you from Community of Grace Lutheran Church right here in Peoria, Arizona. And we are kind of coming down from the high and the excitement of Easter. And as I was trying to understand and try to plan for what would happen next in our series, in our messages, and in our time together, I thought, what better way than to continue the excitement of Easter than to bring back a tradition that has been started long before I got here of Ask Pastor Josh anything. And so this church has a long history of getting to ask questions of its pastors, and I was able to do a few of these with Pastor Tim before his retirement. So I don't know exactly what's coming. I don't know the questions that are here. I don't have any notes. The only thing I brought with me was a Bible to pray over just in case things get tough. But our tech team has a couple of questions lined up for this online service, and let's just get right to them. What's that first question?
In Lutheran theology, how can we make sense of suffering as something that reveals Christ, rather than just a sign of a broken world?
Okay, I thought we were going to get where's your favorite taco place to start the first. I thought we'd get something a little bit easier, but great question. How does suffering, how does our understanding of suffering help us to understand and point to Christ in some way, rather than just as a sign or a revelation of a broken world? I think the broken world part of it is part of it. Some of the suffering that exists in our world and in our lives is just a result of broken people doing broken things. Sometimes it's us having to pay for some mistake that we've made that somehow that in the past is now impacting our present or our future. Sometimes it's other people's brokenness, it's other people's sinfulness that is causing us harm, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. It just happens. And then there's suffering that we endure in this life through some method or means that we can't even try to understand where it comes from. There are so many health conditions and mental health conditions and all sorts of other things that so many of us experience at some point in our lifetime that we really can't point to and say, this is why this is happening. This is why I'm struggling with this, and we can't do that. And so there are a lot of different opinions on this matter. There's lots of different thought processes on, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people even? There's so many necessary thought processes that we go through to try to make sense of it all. And one of the things that comes up consistently throughout Scripture is sort of an idea that suffering is meant to do something with us and for us. And there are some people who point to the Bible and say that God intentionally causes us suffering in order to produce faith in us, or to test us, or to make us stronger. And I think there's some validity to those claims. There's certainly parts in the Bible that can point to that kind of idea. But in all things, and I think this comes up in most of the questions that people address to me, it's important to look beyond individual verses or individual stories and look at the entire story of Scripture and whatever trajectory God is on and whatever trajectory that culture and society is moving towards. I think there's this great story. I think it's in John's Gospel, and they bring a blind man to Jesus, and they want him to be healed, and that's good. And so Jesus does end up doing it. But some of the religious leaders of his day ask him, well, he's blind, he's suffering, he's dealing with something. Somebody must have done something wrong to have this make sense, right? So did this man who was blind from birth manage to sin before he was born, or was it his parents? And Jesus kind of says, no, this man was born blind so that we could reveal God's glory and God's power through what I'm about to do here. Now, some people have taken that to mean, well, that means that every bit of suffering that we endure is meant to point to God's glory. It's meant to make us understand or have faith or go deeper into our love for God. And God has caused this to happen so that those desired outcomes would come. I think it may have been true for this person in John's gospel, but I don't think it's true for all suffering. I do think suffering is something that is a natural consequence of the world. It's a natural consequence sometime of our sin and our neighbor's sin. But I don't believe that God causes us to suffer just so that we'll trust God more or so that we'll love God more. With that being said, I do believe in our Lutheran understanding of things that God can use that naturally occurring suffering. God doesn't try to make lives all sunshine and rainbow here on this side of heaven. God knows that we experience suffering. God knows that we experience those tough times. The Apostle Paul writes about it all the time in Romans, that we should somehow rejoice in our suffering. And also, maybe, I want to say James. I think there's a part in the letter to James where he says something very similar. But God can use our suffering. God can use those times that we are experiencing, those difficult times, to help us to remember that it's not the end, that we're never alone. We're reminded of that classic line in Psalm 23, that whenever we go through those dark times, those darkest valleys, that God is with us. I think God can help us to identify in those times of suffering just how dependent we are on God, just how important it is to reach out to him in faith, just so that we can understand the depths of God's love for us, that even when we're going through the hardest times, even when we're going through the worst of things, even in our doubt, even in our unbelief, God says, hey, even in those moments, I'm here with you. And so it's important for us to recognize that just because the harm that we're experiencing, just because the suffering that we're experiencing isn't because of something that God has done through us, God can use those moments to show us something beautiful. God can use those moments to bring people from our churches and from our families together to help lift us up and to care for us. God can use those moments to elicit some of the best things in this world, even when we're going through some of the worst things that we can imagine. All right, now here's a quick PS tag at the end of this. I mentioned Paul talks about how we rejoice in suffering and how he suffers for the sake of the gospel and all of these incredible things. And so the hard times that he is going through, he's excited about it and he's thrilled with it. That doesn't always have to be our response. Sometimes it's okay for us to acknowledge that things are tough. Secondly, as Christians, we are not persecuted for our faith, especially here in the Western world, no matter what media might try to tell us. We exist in a place where we are very advantaged in our society, and so we are not persecuted for our beliefs like Paul was. Paul's suffering that he often talked about was because he was proclaiming the gospel. He was punished for trying to follow Jesus, and that is an entirely kind of separate thing from us experiencing the suffering that we go through as a natural consequence of being humans or as a natural consequence of the sin that exists within us and in our world. So to really put the end on it, no, God doesn't cause our suffering, but God can absolutely use those times where we feel that we're suffering to help us understand and articulate and truly explore the depths of God's love for us. Hope that clear as mud. Tech booth, let's get another question in.
When was the last time you had a shift in theology on an issue, and what was it?
When was the last time I had a shift in theology about an issue, and what was it? Oh, it's going to get real here, folks. So I could tell you what it was. I had for many, many years in my adult life lived in what I would call a very neutral stance and space when it came to our LGBT siblings who exist in this world. And I had been wrestling for years and years. What does God do with this? What does God say about this? What does the Bible say? What does the church say? What is it we're supposed to do with this? Because it's very easy for us to pick up our English language Bibles and find things in here. I knew this would come in handy. That can really cause some people to have some pause and to struggle with this idea. And some people even use some of those passages and verses to cause harm to other people. And I always knew that was wrong, but I definitely struggled with what it was we're supposed to do with these passages. If we're just reading the plain kind of English on the wall or on the page, there's certain things in there that it does seem to say, hey, some of this doesn't seem to be right. And it wasn't until I actually went off to seminary, and I had a bit of a rebellious streak in it, because our national church, the ELCA, had been moving towards a much more open and welcoming and affirming stance on that, and I just wasn't quite there yet. I didn't think these people should be rejected or they shouldn't have harm caused to them. I think they should be loved and cared for, but I was trying to reconcile what the Bible said, or what I thought the Bible said about these issues, with what I was hearing and what I was experiencing. And so this was while I was in seminary, and I was taking my first couple of classes, and I had in my head, I hear what you guys are saying, but I don't know. It still says in the book that there's some things that we're not supposed to be doing. And so I was challenged by a couple people. I was challenged by some incredible professors to say, why don't you actually go into the Bible? Why don't you actually read it? Why don't you go deep into it? Why don't you read the history? Why don't you understand the culture? Why don't you go back and try to make sense of some of these words? Because what you're reading in English may not be what was intended when it was written in Greek or in Hebrew. And so I said, yeah, that sounds good. I'll be sure to get to that. But it really wasn't until I looked at some of my classmates who identified as LGBTQ+. And I saw the incredible gifts that they brought. I saw the incredible passion that they had for sharing God's love and grace with other people, even at a time and place where so many of them were rejected by their friends, by their family members, some of them by previous churches that they had been in. And it really just made me stop and think. Now, I didn't have this message planned in advance, so I won't say any names, I won't give too many details, but I had so many incredible classmates who were doing incredible sacrifices for the sake of bringing a word of joy and to good news to people who didn't even want to hear it from them, who were so convinced that God loved them above and beyond anything that made them up or that they had done or anything else, that they were willing to risk it all for people who would reject them. And it made me just stop and think and say, maybe I do need to read this more. And I explored the history, and I explored the culture, and I came to find out that most of the references that are against what we would call homosexuality, maybe in the 21st and 20th century, weren't even similarly describing words. They weren't describing the same kinds of relationships that existed 2,000, 3,000 years ago. They just don't apply in the same way that we think they do. And we try to make them, but it doesn't always work that way. And I explored the differences in power dynamics and how this wasn't about the relationships described in the Bible. Very rarely are talking about the kind of equal romantic love that exists between any kind of adult people in this world. And it wasn't something that they were dealing with back then. It was a question of power dynamics and asserting authority and dominance over other people. And those were some of the things that were trying to be addressed in the Bible. It wasn't a consensual thing between two people. And yes, I'm trying very hard to not say too much in an adult way, because we do have kids who enjoy this. But there were all of these things that constantly get thrown at our siblings who have those different kinds of identity markers on that they are born with and that they live with and that they struggle with each and every day. And they kept getting thrown at them saying, this is why you're wrong. And I kept learning more and more as I explored the culture, as I explored the language, that isn't even really what's been talking about. Now, there are certainly some parts of Scripture that seem to point to certain acts being not good. And again, we're not going to give too many details here. And that is something that we do need to wrestle with. It is something that we do not pretend doesn't exist in Scripture. And yet, there are plenty of other times when we read our Bibles that we see instructions that are given to God's people that we have as we have understood the Bible more and more, as we understand not just the plain words on the text, but understand the trajectory and the breadth of God's love for us, that we just say, this doesn't really mean the same things that it used to mean, and it doesn't apply to us in the same ways that it did. There are many parts of the Bible that subjugate women to men and talk about how they should be paid for and made wives of people who have assaulted them. We don't say that we should do that anymore. There are different ways in which people are punished, even for planting their fields in the wrong way that could cause death or harm to them. That's not the way we look at the world anymore. There are so many instances where there are prohibitions against certain things, or even encouraging of how to do things the right way. Things like slavery that we have agreed is not God's plan and purpose for humanity for all time and all places. We have identified that these things existed at a time and place for a certain reason that don't necessarily matter to us as Christians today, those of us who live in grace. And I recognize that not all of us are there. I recognize that there are different ways to read Scripture, but when I look at the entire purpose of Jesus coming into this world to live for us, to die for us on Good Friday, and to rise again for us at Easter, is not to come into this world to condemn it, as John in the 3rd chapter would have us understand, but to love us and to show grace to us and to show grace upon grace upon grace to all of us. And so while we may not all be in the same place in our understanding of this, I hope to grow and to walk alongside people who maybe disagree with me, and to show the breadth of God's love, and to show the incredible gifts that these various people who are so often rejected as the church can bring to the church. And so it is in all of that that I believe that I had this kind of revelatory experience. What would that have been? 6-7 years ago? Maybe a little more now, because now I'm not very good at math. About 7-8 years ago, where I really started to realize that God was saying something more. God was doing something incredible, not just in his scriptures, but in his church and in these incredible people. And so I would just like to invite people to continue in the journey and to explore and study scriptures and to explore and experience the breadth of God's grace and love for us that truly surpasses anything that we could ever understand.